your piece for Foreign Exchanges that I read, which was excellent, is entitled "The Blob is Back." So explain the concept of the blob to people who may not be familiar with the term, and then we can dive into Biden's role in it as president thus far.
Sure. So the blob is kind of an inside the Beltway Washington term that describes basically the foreign policy influence industry that exists in Washington, where essentially, just as there is in Wall Street, there's a revolving door between the military, the government, as well as lobbying firms, think tanks, and defense contractors. And so what happens is there's also, campaign contributions as well as charitable donations by corporations to these think tanks. And so what happens is a lot of groupthink in Washington about what are perceived U.S. national interests, what's best for the American people, while they're largely disconnected from working people who are actually struggling to make ends meet. And so that's where I think on foreign policy in general, we see this huge disconnect between where Washington and where this Washington elite is on foreign policy and then where everyday folks in the United States are.
Well, they're completely unaccountable to anybody, and that's a huge part of the problem. Yet their influence is massive. Biden has essentially centered their needs pretty quickly, the needs of the foreign policy establishment, the blob, which doesn't seem to square with his foreign policy for the middle class tagline, which is interesting. A lot of what he proposed centered around climate policy, which is certainly a national security or foreign policy concern, but in what ways has he, I guess, deviated from the foreign policy to the middle class tagline and centering the blob thus far alongside Secretary of State Tony Blinken?
Sure. I think that there was hope that the president, given his domestic moves in terms of how far left he has moved from even just since the campaign, then foreign policy initial decisions like the decision to end security assistance to Burma due to the coup by the military there, or the announcement about ending U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen, were signs that maybe we were going to chart a different path and that he was going to keep his campaign promises. And what's been curious is that coupled along with those decisions has been a lot of lacking transparency about where the administration wants to take its foreign policy, in addition to seeming like foot dragging on core national security issues that the president has championed, such as re-entering the Iran nuclear deal, which we're seeing positive signals of the U.S. actually engaging meaningfully. But, it didn't have to be a kind of tit for tat for months about who was going to move first. In addition to that, I think in a lot of ways, the president and his team has continued Trump's policies in a lot of ways. There's some, like on Yemen, been some ratcheting back, but we haven't necessarily seen a rebuke of Saudi Arabia like he said he would on the campaign trail. We've seen the president and his team keep in place sanctions on Iran that are devastating to the population in light of the COVID-19 crisis in the country. And so, it's interesting to see the president use such progressive rhetoric, or the Secretary of State talk about centering human rights in U.S. foreign policy, and that is welcome. But in decision making, it seems to yet again those priorities, whether human rights or the environment, get the short shrift for more militarized security concerns.
Yes. Biden on the campaign trail said essentially that he'd bring everything back to the status quo, and he has exceeded expectations, in my view, on the domestic policy front, but certainly status quo when it comes to foreign policy thus far. You mentioned a few different countries there, and I kind of want to go through them point by point, if that's okay with you. The two specific areas that it sounded initially like he was going to be better on was Burma and Yemen, as you mentioned, or Myanmar / Burma and Yemen. He started out okay, but he fell into that standard blobbery, as you mentioned. Let's touch on Yemen first, because I think that's the one at least I'm the most informed on. So basically, when they announced that, the administration announced that they were going to stop supporting offensive operations by Saudi Arabia in the genocide/war in Yemen, very specific language was used, which myself and other people noted at the time, offensive operations, but they would continue to support the blockade, which is essentially still supporting offensive operations. You're making a distinction without a lot of difference just based on the results that come from financially supporting Saudi Arabia in any fashion, as they are one of the main perpetrators of genocide, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world in Yemen. So, can you talk about how that initial rhetoric was very specific, though sounding progressive, was really was not much of a change from what we've seen, and of course, this dovetails with its foreign policy when it comes to Saudi Arabia. So, if you could just touch on those.
Absolutely. So, I think on the war in Yemen, the president staffed his administration in terms of some key roles with folks who had done a mea culpa letter during the Trump years, saying that, the U.S. backing of this war was a total mistake, and we should not be doing this anymore. And so, the announcement was good in that it did eliminate from, press briefings, we know this, a primary part of the DoD's support, ongoing support for the coalition. But at the same time, the administration's approach has basically just been trust us, we're not doing it anymore, versus putting out transparent information about we are not selling these weapons anymore. We are not giving this type of assistance. We are vetting things XYZ, right? And that's where I think it's really challenging, because you have diplomats at the State Department in particular who are now excited that there's a president who at least understands diplomacy, respects its power, and wants to prioritize it. But I think the real question that I talk about in my piece is who is really in the decision-making seat here within the executive branch process, where basically it's called the interagency process, but basically a bunch of different federal agencies come together and kind of lobby for their own interests in policy decisions. And, I think you're completely right in terms of the president has totally surprised me on the domestic front in terms of how far he has gone. And I didn't necessarily have a ton of hope that he would be super progressive on foreign policy. But again, personnel is policy, and he did commit to having a big tent and bringing progressives in. And so there are those folks who are championing a fundamentally new approach to the world. But I think that right now he's created positions of power within the government for individuals who are not elected, who have been within the establishment for decades and really believe in kind of stale thinking. And so I think what's also really interesting about this dynamic is I think as time goes on, especially, we're going to see more potentially splits, I think, generationally within the US government, because, I think fundamentally millennials on down understand that endless war and spending nearly $1 trillion a year at the Pentagon is not making any of us safer, nor is it actually addressing the existential threats that we face.
Hi, I'm Sam Seder. You can watch the rest of this interview and more on our Peacock show, which streams at 5 p.m. weekdays on The Choice from Peacock TV.